Welcome to part 2 of An Introduction to Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. In part 2 we'll have a look at the satirical foci of the 4 journeys. This is for the English Extension 1 Elective Reimagined Worlds for William Clark College. Okay, so the first journey looks at Lilliput and it's more temporal Juvenalian satire. So from the previous presentation, remember that Juvenalian satire is savage political satire. So that's the focus of this particular journey. Swift's portrayal of Lilliput serves to illuminate the arbitrary nature of cultural, political and religious practices and reveals that societies tend to assume their own customs to be just and normal. So we're looking at things with fresh eyes. So we're assessing our personal assumptions. And so we're looking at the assumptions of the people in Lilliput, and in turn that makes us think about our own assumptions. So as we know, Jonathan Swift worked for the Tories and he had a pretty good time giving a hard time to the Whigs, particularly the Whig Prime Minister Walpole. Swift lampooned and ridiculed the Whigs and the Tories and the Catholic Protestant division through the rival parties, the Tramexans and Slamexans. He competing for power in the Lilliputian government, and also the dispute between the Big and the Little Endians. So the Big and Little Endians is mainly religious, but there's also a religious element to the Tramexans and the Slamexans as well. Swift satirises the wars and debates that take place between Catholic France and Protestant England due to religious differences, and that's also between England and Scotland. Romana Chilbury concludes regarding these culture wars, it was made laughable by Swift when he applied them, or satirical elements, to the rebellious and stubborn Big and Little Endians who preferred to die rather than change their egg-breaking habits. So if we have a look at the funny names for a start, Big and Little Endians. So it's quite a diminutive name, isn't it? Something that you might expect a 2-year-old to call something. So by doing this, he's diminishing, I suppose, the moral capacity of those people who are arguing. So he's saying basically that they're childish. And it's the same with the names of the Tramexans and the Slamexans. These silly names have a really important role in this satire because they're showing really who should be believed and who is juvenile and untrustworthy. So in terms of the Big Endians, the Little Endians, the Lilliputians, I'm down here now at this dot point. The Lilliputians had divisions in religion on the basis of a controversy and a doctrine from their prophet. That's like their Bible, which stated that all true believers shall break their eggs at the convenient end. Now you can see from that statement that it's actually ambivalent, that you can break the eggs at whatever end you want. So the first layer of satire is that why would a religious doctrine such as a Bible or something, tell you which end to break your egg at? And the second is that it's ambivalent. And the story goes is that a previous king of Lilliput cut his finger when he was opening an egg generations ago, and because of that they now go to war about which end to break your boiled egg over. Now, of course, there's no logical conclusion like don't worry about it, who cares, or let's just eat omelettes, but no, they go to war and people die. So in Gulliver's Travels, Swift writes, the 2 great empires of Lilliput and Blefuscu, which 2 mighty powers have, as I was going to tell you, been engaged in a most obstinate war for 36 moons past, so that's months. 11,000 persons have at several times suffered death rather than submit to break their eggs at the smaller end. So people have died over something truly pathetic. And that is part of this beautiful ironic satire. Okay, so let's have a look at more Juvenalian satire. The Tramexans or high heels and the Slamexans or low heels symbolise the Tories and the Whigs. So Swift satirised political divisions with differences as insignificant as the size of one heels. It's 1/14 of an inch, I think Earlier, I referred to it as 1/18 of an inch. My bad. I was probably half a millimetre out. It is clear that Swift is referring to the dispute between the Whigs and the Tories when in Chapter 4, and so this is Part 1, Chapter 4, he describes the bitterness between the high hills and the low hills. The animosity of these two factions runs so high that they will neither eat, nor drink, nor speak to each other. Doesn't it sound like petulant children? The king was a low heel in politics, but the heir apparent was a high heel. So there you go. And so again, their pettiness of their divisions is shown in this portrayal. So it's definitely lampooning party politics. So lampooning is sending up or satirising. Swift satirised the moral corruption prevalent in politics in England and by association Ireland, Scotland and Wales by ridiculing the unfair way people were elected to British Parliament with the absurd way people in Lilliput won their political positions. So through rope dancing and leaping over sticks. The candidates for the ministerial positions were trained to dance on straight ropes from an early age, and only those who were able to dance on ropes with dexterity became ministers. It's pretty much similar to the British aristocracy having access to education and other ideas that other elements of society didn't have. And here's a quote: "For, as to that infamous practice of acquiring great employment," so this is a job, "by dancing on the ropes or badges of favour and distinction, by leaping over sticks and creeping under them." So this was a legit way that the Lilliputian government selected candidates. And Swift, I think, is arguing that's a similar absurdity that only people who are of a particular social class, that's the aristocracy, are able to lead in government. So that's why you have the House of Lords in British government, which in Australia we call the upper house. So the House of Lords is the positions are passed on from father to son, never a woman, oh dear me, no, and it's only people from the aristocracy. So an example of that in Lilliput is Phil Knapp, who's the treasurer of Lilliput, is said to be the best rope dancer and regarded highly by the emperor. Here Swift laments the favouritism and the nepotism, so that's jobs for friends, that exists in English political institutions. Positions were won by social hierarchy and relationships, not by fair means or merit in English society. And I think this is a little bit hypocritical of Swift himself because he got his first job through connections of friends. So Swift himself was a little bit of a hypocrite as well. Okay, let's have a look at the second island or the second journey. So this is the land of the Brobdingnags, which is more savage or temporal Juvenalian satire. So Gulliver is now the reverse of his role in the previous island. So this is the conceit of size, and this journey is a mirror of the previous. Whereas Gulliver was superior in size and morality to the Lilliputians, now he's physically and morally lesser or smaller than the Brobdingnags. Lilliput was full of civil controversies and political intrigue, whereas the land of the giant Brobdingnags is a society of simple laws with little civil litigation. So that means people didn't sue each other. Whereas Lilliput was an allegorical satire of British politics, the customs and political practices of Europeans as a whole are under the critical scrutiny of the Brobdingnag king. So they're seen to be morally and philosophically superior to European cultural practices. It's a moral critique of Europeans' propensity for political intrigue and their use of violence. There's a lovely image there on the right to show the king of Brobdingnag and little old Gulliver. And this is a quote from part 2, chapter 6, and in my copy of the novel, which is a Penguin classic, it's on page 120. He wondered to hear me talk, so this is the king, he wondered to hear me talk of such chargeable and expensive wars, that certainly we must be a quarrelsome people or live among some very bad neighbours, and that our generous much needs be richer than our king. So he's saying only the generals make money in times of war. Here's another quote. He was perfectly astonished with the historical account I gave him of our affairs during the last century, protesting it was only a heap of conspiracies, rebellions, murders, massacres, revolutions, banishments, and the very worst effects that avarice, so that's greed, faction, which is like gossiping and friction, hypocrisy, perfidiousness, which is just being a smartass, cruelty, rage, madness, hatred, envy, lust, malice, and ambition could provide. I cannot but conclude the bulk of your, so this is the King's critique of Europe. I cannot but conclude the bulk of your natives to be the most pernicious race of little odious vermin that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth. And that's in part 2, and it's at the end of chapter 6. So that's another very useful quote that you can include. So he describes Europeans as the most pernicious race of little odious vermin. So because of their propensity for conspiracies and war. Okay, so there's more then. So Gulliver, in his role as the naive traveller, boasts about the invention of gunpowder, which actually came from China, not that they'd acknowledged that at the time, and other superior contraptions such as cannons. And the King of Brobdingnag was not impressed. He was instead horrified. And here's a lovely quote. The king was struck with horror at the description I'd given him of these terrible engines, which are guns and cannons, and the proposal I had made. He was amazed how so impotent and grovelling an insect as I, and these were his expressions, could entertain such inhuman ideas, and in so familiar a manner. Some evil genius, enemy to mankind, must have first contrived. So what he's done is he's turned Gulliver's arrogance on his head. So you can see in the above yellow quote that the King of Brobdingnag has described Europeans as the most pernicious race of little odious vermin. Here he's described Gulliver as so impotent and grovelling an insect. And then the inventor of these things has inhuman ideas, is some evil genius, an enemy to mankind. So you can see the clear moral capacity, or he's got a greater capacity of the King of Brobdingnag than Gulliver. So that reflects his size as well. And that's another example of the conceit of size that indicates moral capacity. Okay, so let's have a look at the third journey. The third journey is a bit of a around the world trip. He goes to Laputa, Bolnibari, Lugnag, Glubdubdrib, and Japan. So let's have a look at the names at the top of the screen to start off with. Laputa, which is actually an insulting name in Spanish, and it's off the coast of Japan. Bolnibarbi, Lugnag, Glubdubdrib. Now, don't these make you think of names that a 2-year-old would come up with? Lugnag and Glubdubdrib. Seriously, that's preschool language. And this is one of the common tricks that Swift does throughout, is that he uses the names to diminish people's, I suppose, importance. Through Gulliver, Jonathan Swift travels to 4 different foreign countries, each representing a corrupt part of English society and values. Swift criticises the corruption of these parts and focuses on the government, society, science, religion, and man. Swift not only criticises the customs of each country, he mocks the naive man who has the inability to figure out the double meaning of things. And Gulliver, who's Gulliver, believes that everything he's told, which symbolises the irony of the English system. So remember, Gulliver is an everyday everyday man. He's an everyman. So he's a gullible everyman. So through the Laputians and their flappers, Swift is mocking the intellectuals who are so deep in thought that they've lost touch with practical concerns. So the flappers, remember, are the servants of the Laputian intellectuals, and they have a gourd filled with seeds. So that's an empty, I suppose, like a pumpkin filled with seeds that they tap on the side of the head of these so-called intellectuals so that they know where to look. It's very much like extreme autism. The ill-fitting clothes and other disastrous projects Gulliver observes are Swift, so that's the first two places in particular, Laputa and Bolnabarbi. The ill-fitting clothes and other disastrous projects Gulliver observes a Swift's way of mocking the Royal Society, so that's the scientific society, which at one point, no joke, wanted to use scientific knowledge to make crafts more efficient. Okay, so that would make sense if they were going to make machines for weaving faster and that kind of thing, which eventually happens. But no, apparently they were applied to theories of mathematics. However, most of the knowledge gained by the society, so this is the Royal Society of Science, is theoretical and offers no new or useful technologies. So this makes me think of things like theoretical physics and other such scientific pursuits that they don't actually have practical implications, but it's the idea of them that people like. Okay, so Laputa is the flying island. And of course, that's also evident in one of the films by Studio Ghibli. So Laputa, so a little bit of Japanese anime. So this is a critique of Britain's subjugation of Ireland. So most obviously in Laputa, Swift criticises a world of mathematical and philosophical endeavour which does little or nothing to better people's lives, especially those of their subjects in the colony Bolnabarbi, located beneath the flying Laputa. So basically what they do is the Laputians say they're going to throw rocks at Bolnabarbi, or they're going to drop their flying island on them and squash them. In fact, by satirising the power relations of Britain and Swift's native island, or more broadly the rich and the poor, we find that Laputa is used to subdue Bolnabarbi by threats to block the sun or rain, or by throwing down rocks, or even by crushing rebel cities by lowering Laputa on it. So they're a bit nasty, the Laputians. Okay, so it's satire on the scientific approach of the Royal Society. So remember, we're looking at the empirical approach to science. It's all about observation. In Laputa, the flying island of Laputa, a kingdom devoted to the arts of music, maths and astronomy, but they were unable to use them for practical ends. It contrasts to the practical lifestyle of Lord Menotti with crazy schemes carried on at the Grand Science Academy, so Grand Academy of Science. These include researching completely preposterous schemes, such as extracting sunbeams from cucumbers, softening marble for use in pillows, learning how to mix paint by smell, and uncovering political conspiracies by examining the excrement of suspicious persons. So thus, the obsession with excrement or shit continues. Okay, so, and here's a quote. One of the scientists that Gulliver observed had been 8 years upon a project for extracting sunbeams out of cucumbers. But, poor man, he was having a hard time because the price of cucumbers had gone up and he needed Gulliver to give him a donation so he could live, and he thought in another 8 years he might have something useful. This is presented as a travel narrative reporting on the extraordinary sights and experiences in foreign lands in a calm, detached, and whenever possible, quantitative fashion. So this is more of this scientific approach. The Royal Society had often encouraged travellers to make such records and reported on information collected in circumstances that ranged across formal experiment, mathematical proof, astronomical observation, fieldwork, library work, happenstance, and even hearsay. And of course, in Australia, we know that because we had various explorers, Dirk Hartog on the west coast, and we had the Endeavour, and a lot of those ships collected samples of native species as they went. So this idea of empirical research or observational research was actually quite a powerful scientific idea at the time. It was actually very prevalent, and Swift is commenting on that. Okay, so another part of the third journey, visits to the islands Lugnag, Glubbdrib, and Japan. So there's moral critique here. Swift mocks the human tendency to revere the past and historical figures, ignoring the fact that these people are merely human. I was chiefly disgusted with modern history, Gulliver tells, and how low an opinion I had of human wisdom and integrity when I was truly informed. This is part 3, chapter 8, page 236. And this is where, remember that Gulliver could call up ghosts from the past. At this point in the story, Gulliver, as well as the reader, are plainly aware of Swift's increasing misanthropy, so he's very critical. Glubbdrib signifies the island of sorcerers or magicians, and it's about 1/3 as large as the Isle of Wight and extremely fruitful. It's governed by a head of certain tribes who are all magicians. In Lugnag, Gulliver encounters the Strodbrugs, or a race of immortals, who unfortunately for them age eternally without dying, and they're bloody miserable with it. Gulliver's previous wishes for eternal life are exploded by seeing these miserable, senile, decrepit, despised human beings. Here Swift may be attacking theological notions of bodily as opposed to spiritual immorality. So he was really savage. And the wording that he used, just like an example that I gave you, was actually quite crude in places for their time. Japan is the only real destination in Gulliver's travels, and it's a country then closed to all foreigners. He gets into trouble by refusing to trample on a crucifix, a legit test that Japanese people actually imposed on suspected Europeans at that time. So that was the test, if they were European, if they were Christian or not. Now, the final and fourth journey was to the land of the Hoymans. Now, you're supposed to say this name with your lips in the shape of like a horse who's going neighing, so Hoyman. It's a misanthropic critique, so it's misanthropy. It's a misanthropic critique, which is a critique of humanity. The country of the Hoymans is the most significant section of Gulliver's travels. It's the idea of a surface utopia that actually is a dystopia when you look deeper. Much of part 4 is devoted to extended passages of satire about history and politics and the manners and morals of modern Europe. So there's lots of allegories within this journey. Perceiving the Hoymans as perfect, Gulliver thus begins to perceive himself and the rest of humanity as imperfect yahoos. The Hoymans exhibit reason and they have very strict social structures, and the human-like beings, or the yahoos, seem devoid of reason and civility. And I have to say, I have Yahoo email, so maybe that's me. I'm an uncivilized human. A traditional popular definition of man studied was Swift was not just Descartes, I think, therefore I am, but also Homo est animal rational. Humans are rational animals. So a lot of the sayings in those days were Latin, and this is an example of one of those Latin sayings. Okay, so humans are rational animals. So Swift is making a satire of this by taking it a step further and actually making these horse creatures like rational animals, rational humans. Voyage 4 is the extreme variation of the world of comedy, is another reimagined world that's an impossibility and a contradiction, and which is one of the basic definitions of comedy and a joke. The Land of the Hoymans is a philosophical comedy. So these are phrases that you can use where utopia is revealed to be an absurd dystopia. That's a reflection on the contradiction and failures of the current state of humanity. So that's, you can use that whole sentence there in an essay. You're allowed. You have my permission. The Heumans are a philosophical game about the preoccupation with reason that defined the early stage of the Age of Enlightenment. So it's also the Age of Enlightenment. It's also called the Age of Reason, as you know. The Heumans are creatures of simple, idealized reason without moral complexity, without compassion, and without emotion. The Yahoos are violent, sordid, and subhuman. So much so that they threw shit at Gulliver when they first saw him. That's their response to him. And that's very similar to monkeys that apparently had been shown at the London Zoo at this time. So that's one of their defense mechanism, is that they throw their own excrement at invaders. And that's, so one of the Yahoos went up into a tree and shat on Gulliver, and that was one of their defences. The account of their appearance is based on monkeys, there you go, on display in London. As a reflection of humanity, this journey is bleak and horrific, and in part a game with voyeuristic attention, so that's that intimate details to human nakedness, and aesthetic and physical repulsion again. And at one point, poor old Gulliver is attacked by a female Yahoo who tries to rape him. So there's also elaborate metafictive elements in here, and I should probably include this. So this particular section is quite metafictive because it's playing with the form itself. So it's, remember, it's an elaborate play on the thing that was not, and that comes from this journey. Gulliver's discourse about truth, lies and customs in chapter 4 provides a dramatic version of satire as a representation of an imagined world, and it's also about a debate about humanity. The double view, so it's a fake recount of people discussing fake recounts, so it's an untruthful book about untruth. The double view includes that Gulliver's account is addressed to a rational horse, who is a creature of reason different to humans in some essential ways. A horse doesn't have a cultural conditioning to tell or understand lies. Okay, so they don't have a word for a lie, so they describe it as the thing that was not. So this journey has some very heavy, so really obvious irony about reason, and Swift as the liar satirist. So that's some of that metafictive element there. So it's quite powerful and actually quite entertaining once you understand it. It takes a little bit of work to get it initially, but it's absolutely worth it once you do. False representation is in fact what Swift is engaged in his account of Gulliver and the land of the Heumans. So the whole account is an absurd lie, and that's part of this beautiful metafictive element within this journey. Gulliver explains that their conversation about lying and false representation, the phrase is a multiple reference for later readers, and it works as strategic ambiguity. So the phrase is the thing that was not. Okay, and that's the phrase that comes up in Gulliver's letter, but also within this discussion. Swift builds on the traditional ideas about rhetoric and philosophical communication, including classical debate about the sophists who use rhetoric in this way, which was elaborate lies. And that's, of course, what he studied at university. There's also an echo of Plato's claim in his treatise called The Republic that all poets, and by implication, all writers, are liars. So all poets and all writers are liars. Again, this really powerful idea, as they deal in fiction rather than rational and scientific truth. Gulliver's fake journey narrative is a false representation for the purpose of satiric comedy, and the master's next response is a formulation that works as an ironic definition of comedy and jokes. The use of speech, this is a quote, the use of speech was to make us understand one another and to receive information of facts. Now, if anyone said the thing which was not, which is our term for lies, these ends were defeated. Essentially, the argument is that by enjoying the absurdity of comedy and satire, the thing which was not, we're able to more clearly understand the thing which was, which is the purpose of satire, which is critique or correction of follies and vices. Remember, that's the purpose of critique, the correction of follies and vices. In Swift's literary representation of Gulliver in his letter for the second edition, he wrote a clear reference to this concept. So he made me say the thing that was not. So again, the lies. So we're going to end with this. This is the final slide. Swift's account is a comedy that is a philosophical game, with conventional comedy replaced by darkly Juvenalian satiric, political and philosophical variations on humanity. And that's another lovely sentence that you can use in your essay. So I hope you've enjoyed this introduction. Go forth and slay essays.